Hello, everyone. Thank you all for coming to our first career panel at the Collegian. My name is Denham. I usually hear pronouns, and I'm one of the PR coordinators here at the Daily Collegian. This panel is highlighting a few of the wonderful women who got their start in journalism here at the newspaper, and then went on to have fulfilling careers, taking their lessons from the Collegian along the way.
My name is Jamie Liu. I graduated in 2003, and I am now a communications manager at Illinois Institute of Technology, also known as Illinois Tech in Chicago, Illinois.
Hey, I'm Lisa Creamer. I'm the managing editor of digital at WBUR. That's the NPR station in Boston. And I graduated in 2014.
Hi, my name is Afnan Nihila. Graduated in 2018, so not that far ago. Kind of still miss it. I'm currently the communications director for State Senator Jamie Eldridge in Massachusetts.
Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Alana DeGrasse. I'm the president and founder of Turning on the Lights Global Institute, and happy to be here.
First question is, what drew you to your particular career path?
So when I was at UMass Amherst, I was a BDIC major, and I wanted to combine my love for journalism, women's studies, and communications and creativity. Obviously, you have to think, how will that all tie in? So BDIC, that program allowed me to create my own major, and really being a part of the Collegian was part of that, because I was taking journalism classes, but at the same time, I was able to kind of activate my passions in Black affairs and women's studies. And, you know, that led the impetus for me starting out. I started out working in freelance and as an intern at Black Entertainment Television. And from there, I really realized that I wanted to educate around communication, and I wanted to get more into really where people were at. So I took the path of teaching more communication styled courses at universities, et cetera. But then that completely transformed into what I'm doing today, because I realized that, you know, everyone has a story. And even as people are pivoting right now, when we think of COVID-19, one of the biggest things is helping them to tell that story, especially small business owners. So for me, the career path was not one of those straight paths that started out like, I'm going to be a journalist and I'm going to stay in that field. It was more like, these are the components and elements that I can utilize to really help people become who they say they want to be and help brands expand where they're at. So that kind of led me to where I am today. And I hope that answers your question.
All right, so I am one of those very different, strange people who knew that they wanted to be a journalist when I was like 10 years old. I created my first like burn it all down zine at that age. And then, you know, rather than taking out my angst on like poor children, I learned that the target of my efforts to, you know, get people to be held accountable for things should be people with actual power. And that thread just sort of continued on and became what has now been like a lifelong obsession. And I've been able to be supported in a lot of those initiatives, certainly at the Collegian by my peers, and then also a few key professors. Shout out Rosman Sibi. Yeah, I still every day am grateful that I'm able to help shape the stories that really get at the idea of whose feet you got to put to the fire and ask the smart questions. So yeah, that's basically how I got started. It's like a terrible story about being a kid who like, you know, just really wanted to get out some angst, but there's a lot of wonderful things that can come of a career in journalism.
Oh, I started my career as a newspaper journalist. I was a journalism major at UMass, and that was my dream job. I always thought I was going to be in journalism forever, that I would retire in journalism. And when I graduated, I wanted to be a multimedia journalist, and that was before multimedia journalism actually existed. So a lot of people thought I was crazy. There was no such thing as combining like broadcast and like video packaging with writing. So I ended up going into newspapers. That's the path that was open to me at the time after I was done with grad school. And over the course of being a reporter, I discovered I really loved government and public affairs reporting. So, I mean, you know, a lot of the things that Lisa just talked about, just really holding, you know, public officials like accountable, really telling important stories about government, what's happening in our communities. So that was what led me to this really interesting opportunity to launch a nonpartisan news website focused on the First Amendment for a nonprofit foundation here in Chicago. And so I guess the short story is I went to go work for that foundation, launched this news website, and because of strategic planning and changes in leadership, the news website ended up going away. But because they had a traveling museum focused on the First Amendment, and the website was originally part of that, teaching like students, like specifically middle school and high school students, about democracy and civics, and empowering their teachers with the resources to sort of teach these subjects too in the classroom. I realized, those were things I was really passionate, like at the very core of everything I'd been doing, as a journalist, and then transitioning into sort of this like museum kind of career, online resources career and writing. It was really all about, civics and rule of law. And so that sort of translated into, a few other things that happened along my career path, where that's always kind of been that central point, and led me to, communications and public relations that, I'm doing now. And, the thing I learned is, as a communications professional, if you work for organizations, with the missions and goals that are in line with your interests and values, you'll never be bored. You'll always have career satisfaction. So I'll admit, part of me like really misses being in a news environment, really will always miss journalism. It's always gonna be part of me. But I'm so glad that, I can keep on moving my career in a way where I continue to be a storyteller and I continue to do really cool things.
So for me, what personally drew me to my career path right now is that growing up, I've always known and understood that there is a desperate need for representation for my community, especially when it comes to having a voice in American media or government. And we're seeing how incredibly important that is right now with all this political rhetoric and whatnot that's going on in the media. So I've always felt that I had this responsibility, whether it was through media, journalism, or just being in, the responsibility was to be in certain realms where I could speak up on behalf of my community and give them a voice in places that don't usually give them any platforms or any voices whatsoever. And so it was really interesting when I was first told about the position of being a communications director at the Massachusetts State House. They were telling me that there was two kind of alarming facts. The first one was that there has never been a Muslim legislature ever in the entire Massachusetts history. And the second one was that there has never been a hijab wearing, which means the scarf that I'm wearing right now, staffer in the State House as well. And I remember being super, super alarmed by those facts and just being like, it's not even a matter of, trying to be a first, but it's a matter of like, at this point, it's kind of like my obligation to really step up to these platforms and at least have that representation there and doing my duty in that sense.
How would you say your experience at the Collegian has helped you so far?
Oh, as I was just listening to Afnan talk and the others, I immediately brought myself back to the campus of what it meant for me to be a journalist. And I just remember always having my yellow notebook and pen and like ready to go to any event to cover a story. Like that discipline definitely prepared me for what I'm doing today. Whether I'm writing books or creating new content or going to speak on stage, putting together a certain program. There's just some certain ethics and disciplines that you have as a leader that just stick with you. And that really established the foundation for where I am today. It's like, I'll know, oh no, today I need to get up at this time to write this story, and these are things that I definitely learned, at the Collegian, but also too, the perspective taking and making sure that when you're covering a story, you're thinking about all angles and you're not just looking at a story from your perspective, but you're stepping in maybe someone else's shoes and saying, oh, what's the other perspective here? So I think that those foundational aspects of, storytelling, perspective taking, but also showing up and not not being that person that sits back, but you're like taking that initiative to go there and do it. That is what I think about when I think of the Collegian.
So the Collegian has given me so much. And so I think first I want to talk about some of the the skill sets that Alana was just saying, and it's like, because there's so much that is a mess often when you are working at an independent student media organization, and there are so many problems that you're going to encounter that are new and like exciting and sometimes really scary, the Collegian gave me the confidence that I needed to be able to kind of tackle that one by one and really have like the focus and like, you know, the drive that I was responsible. I needed to be accountable to the community that I served. And that's such an important thing to carry with you to every newsroom or whatever, you know, wonderful like media adjacent organization that you're working for, to do a real public good and really accept that responsibility. You know, it's different from being in a more like it's, I would say that college journalists, they're real journalists, you know, the same stakes are there. So that was wonderful to have that as a training ground. And then there's the like community that you have, right, that supports that ability, that supports that confidence. And that is what that's like one of the most enduring, you know, advantages, privileges that I got from the Collegian, is that my best friends to this day are like the weird collection of strangers that happen to be interested in running a like newspaper in a dirty basement that definitely had asbestos right next door, and like would watch me like while I smoke cigarettes in the parking garage, even though I wasn't supposed to. Like those are to this day, like when I have ethical problems, or want to just talk something through, when I can't quite figure out what the angle of the story should be, I still call them to double check. And, you know, that's what you get out of your time at the Collegian, is people who will never let you down, who will never not pick up that phone.
Kind of want to echo a little bit of what Lisa said about confidence. I think the Collegian, if there was one thing that it gave me, was definitely the confidence. There was no such thing as like a story that was too crazy or a story that was too abnormal or whatever it was. Anything that like, you know, I thought of, I pitched, editor-in-chief at that time was just like, yes, go for it, amazing. And it would always like stun me till today. And I carry that with me, and just like, you know, taking that initiative and just like suggesting something, even if it sounds so absurd in my mind. Another thing that it definitely, you know, I carry with me till today is really the ability to listen and relay stories effectively and productively. Listening was like, I didn't realize how much of a science it really is to actively listen to someone that you're interviewing or to someone that you're trying to write a story about. And I see that now all the time when I'm working in the office of State Senator Jamie Eldridge, is that, you know, listening, you know, you get so many phone calls on the daily from constituents, from advocates, from coalition members, and you really just genuinely have to learn how to listen to those individuals and be able to relay their stories to you know, a legislator or a lawmaker. So it really was the equation of understanding how to listen and share stories. The variables have just changed. Back then it was more like college students and individuals inside the student, and now it's more constituents and advocates. And back then my target audience was more students as well, and professors, and now my target audience is more politicians and lawmakers. So it's really just different variables wherever I go. But I feel like the equation and really the process of how to effectively do it correctly was learned from the Collegian. Until today, I always give them props for that.
I mean, I think I echo what everybody else has said about sort of the skills and the drive, the confidence that being at the Collegian gives you. Just that experience of, you know, being in the newsroom, you know, the leadership and organizational skills that you get from being at the Collegian, working with fellow editors, you know, working with columnists, and just that team aspect of everybody like working together to put out the paper every day is huge. And it really does kind of continue with you throughout your career. I was the op-ed editor during my senior year at the Collegian. And in my job now in communications, I do a lot of ghostwriting. I do ghostwriting op-eds for various people. And I also help faculty members like edit their op-eds. So it's kind of interesting to come full circle in this different way, that I'm able to use those skills from that experience and, you know, translate it now, and especially working, you know, in an academic environment. You know, there's a lot of people that write in a very academic kind of voice, and being able to kind of edit and take that voice and make sure it's engaging for audiences is definitely like one of the hard skills I took from the Collegian. One other thing I'm going to mention is, and because I've, you know, been thinking about this question a lot, is, you know, something that's more of a, I guess less of that sort of like the practical hard skills of being there, and more of a just sort of moving through your career. And this was a lesson that for me started at the Collegian, has kind of continued over the years, and I've continued to kind of hone and figure out is, you know, you're responsible for the energy that you bring to a room. Like, you're responsible for your own energy. You can't control what other people, you know, are doing or what they think about you. You can only control, you know, the energy you bring to a room. So, you know, just being true to yourself and who you are, and, you know, controlling how you know, react to things. So, you know, to be honest, so like I said, I was the op-ed editor during my senior year. The first few years of the Collegian, I actually wasn't physically in the newsroom. I was in the newsroom. And, you know, that's because the Collegian was mostly a boys' club in the years that I was there, quite frankly. From 1999 to about 2002, up until my senior year, it was mostly a boys' club. It wasn't diverse at all. There were very few women. There were very few people of color. And, you know, there were definitely some editors there that were, had some, you know, misogynistic tendencies. There wasn't a lot of room for disagreement or dissent in the newsroom. I made the mistake, I guess, during my sophomore year of disagreeing with one of the editors on policy change at the Collegian regarding the Collegian's diversity pages. And I was immediately branded an enemy, complete traitor, like just kind of like outcast, like shoved to the side. And because I wasn't really in the newsroom very much, nobody knew me. Like very few people knew me on a personal basis. And it wasn't until like I became friends with some of the Collegian editors in one of my journalism classes that I kind of came back into the fold. I was kind of invited back into the Collegian family. And when I was hired as the op-ed editor, I knew I was walking into a hostile environment. Like I knew there were people there that had heard awful things about me for years. And, you know, I could have gone in there with a giant chip on my shoulder or feeling embarrassed or like self-conscious, you know, that people believed these things that were said about me. And I thought, you know what, I'm just determined to come in here and just be myself. I'm going to be myself, keep my head held up high. If people like me, great. You know, and the only thing you can control is how you personally react to it and how it personally affects you. So, and that's not to say you have to be positive, upbeat, happy all the time, you know, in your work. Like you're going to have some really bad and awful days, but, you know, you can decide, you know, when someone's being unreasonable or awful to you, are you going to sink to their level and respond in kind? Are you going to let it roll off you? Are you going to try a different approach? So the best thing you can do is always be yourself, and, you know, don't give things that are not worth your emotional time real estate in your minds to bother you. So that's something that I think, you know, like I said, it's a lesson that kind of started for me at the Collegian, and it's just kind of carried like all the way through.
That was very powerful. I want to get that in a plaque. You're responsible for the energy that you bring to a room, because it is true.
It wasn't like, oh, I'm going to write a column. It was like, no, people have these real issues. Our students have these issues, and they're coming to me with those issues. And I think it's my responsibility to bring their voices to light. So that was really what the climate was when I was there.
Purpose of student reporters is to really highlight the student experience and really elevate the students' voices, particularly those that maybe the administration hasn't been listening to.
Well, I just want to say, like, you know, I think we're at the foundation of what we're saying. We love the Collegian, but I think one thing we should stress is how valuable that is. When you know, research shows that when you show someone their voice matters, it creates a different environment and a different experience for them. And I have to just thank the Collegian and my experience for creating that space to have dialogues, even though there were times like, you know, there were times when I was like, okay, I'm just you know, this person of color and I'm supposed to be the voice for all these people, right? But then to have the space and the platform to do it, that is the beautiful part. And I think when I look back at that, I'm like, wow, we were doing, and that was at a time where people were questioning me like, well, why are you covering these issues, right? So it's not like we were just singing Kumbaya and going down the road and writing little, you know, stories. We were really covering issues that are still definitely happening today. So I just had to say that. I don't mean to go off your question, but I think at the forefront is that it's still real news, and it's still looking at where are the voices and where do we need to bring elevation to some of these needs.
What is something you wish you knew before you entered your field?
There are hard skills that I think are very valuable for people to have that I would get that education now. Like, get really good at Excel and some basic organizational skills around Google Sheets or Excel and some basic math skills. You're going to want to know the differences in that arena, because your stories will be enriched by data at some point. This is assuming you want to be a journalist, which is what I can speak to. But like, I know that also basic math skills will help most people in any field. As far as like some like more soft skills, I like think about this all the time. Like, I go home and I think about how much I don't know about things. So I think every person at a very young age should make immediately this acceptance that you are like smart, but not so smart, and then build in mechanisms throughout your life that will enable you to make smart decisions, even if you lack the base of knowledge that would help you immediately. So you need to make connections with people who are smarter than you in different areas, pay attention to those people, keep building those connections with them, so that you can actually go to them when the story or whatever situation arises where you need to talk that through. You should always be sort of double checking your instinct with other people. I really think that it's not like I didn't really innately know some of that back then, but I really just want to put a finer point on it, because it's something that as I've gotten older, I certainly have just been coming back to that idea repeatedly, that you really need a lot of safety nets in a way, in order. Some of it's the business model of journalism. There's just like a lot more expectation, essentially, to be able to, there used to be newspapers that had many reporters on the same beat, and now you can see like this huge reduction in staffing makes it so that everybody's kind of a pinch hitter for like all kinds of litany of subjects. And specializing is such a privileged thing in this field now. What suffers is like your audience, right? So whatever you can do at this point in your career, should you want to be a journalist, and I imagine that much of this advice will carry over, regardless of what you'd like to do. But I would do whatever you can now to try to understand like essential systems in government, in business, anything you can do to have that kind of like homework already out of the way, so that when you come across a story or some sort of subject matter that you need to be like knowledgeable about quickly, you don't feel as scared. Simultaneously, you also have lined up some contacts that you can actually like talk that stuff through, and the knowledge that I am not like the smartest person. I'm gonna check all of it, every single part of it, with somebody.
For me, it's a little bit similar to kind of what Lisa just ended with, but one of the big things that took me kind of a while to really internalize is that no matter how much schooling a person goes through, no matter how much reading, researching, Googling, whatever it is that you really read up on something, anytime you enter a new job, there's going to be a learning curve. And it's going to be really, really steep. And to just be okay with that, and okay with the fact that it's going to be just another institution that you have to learn every single thing about. You have to learn the mechanisms, the inner workings, and really the foundations of how to even work this job. And I think for me, I was kind of sort of under the impression that, you can learn something in school and just be able to be ready the first day of work and just like ace everything and master everything, when that's really, really not the case at all. So that's a huge thing that I really, really wish I knew before entering this field, because it would have put me more at ease as I was like going gradually through the months and learning things slowly. Just knowing that was a normal process, and that's how everything works, regardless of what effort I put in beforehand. And another thing is also the importance of communication, and just really talking about what it is that is on your mind, what it is that is bothering you, what it is that you think is important. Not enough emphasis was given to me on really just stating things, regardless of how intimidated or scared I was. And it really all came down to just like my attitude and my behavior in stating them, and not really the content itself. So that's something that I also wish I understood the importance of. And it is definitely going to be a learning process as you grow older. I think definitely no one masters that completely, but there is such a huge critical element to it that really can be super valuable when starting or embarking on any new journey.
So I've been in communications and like public relations now for about 5 years. And so I think one of the myths I kind of had going into it, because part of my switch over was for work-life balance, because the last newspaper I was working at was a small newspaper, and it was, we were understaffed and it was crazy at times. It was a lot of 12, 14-hour days. My husband and I were thinking of starting a family at that point. So I mean, part of the move to communications and public relations was work-life balance. And I've learned that communications, public relations does not necessarily give you work-life balance. It all kind of comes down to, what your organization is, your company or your organization is, and like how it's staffed. So it depends on the organization, depends on like the boss and who you work for and everything. The other thing I've learned is that, what I wish I knew was that, the clients that you work with in communications and PR are not necessarily always open to hearing your strategies and your ideas. So learning how to kind of manage expectations can be really frustrating at times. And there's a lot of times that there's nothing you can do about it. So you could advise your clients to do something one way, and they could say, no, that's totally wrong. And then when they don't get the result they want, they might be completely annoyed at you and be like, why didn't it work? And you can't really say, well, you didn't follow my direction. You sort of need to figure out how to like very carefully thread the needle for how to manage expectations and kind of steer them back in a way that will lead to a good outcome. And there's days it takes me forever to write emails because like I'm so carefully thinking about how to kind of communicate with them and strategize in a way that helps them feel empowered, to voice their opinions, but also to understand that it's like, I've got experience in this. I can help like you go in the right direction. Like you just need to trust me and follow along with me a little bit.
Yeah, so I think when I think back of my time, I think that one thing that may have been beneficial is really having the opportunity to have roundtable talks with people who had similar experience, like what we're doing right now, but being able to tap into industry perspective, right? Like, how did you go from your time at the Collegian to the industry you work in? So somewhat of what we're doing right now, but I wish if I were back then, there were more of these kind of like mentoring relationships, especially for those who are like seniors. So you can kind of have a better understanding of, well, if you go into television and you do that kind of reporting, what's going to happen? If you go into nonprofit work, then this is the way that your skill sets can be used. I think having that transition or having those opportunities would be really, really valuable. I mean, eventually I figured that out, right? But having that there beforehand kind of would help to really validate what you're doing. Because I think when I look back at my time as a writer there at the Collegian, you don't really realize the value you are really bringing to that campus by sharing these stories and covering things, because you're just doing it because you love it and you're passionate. But I think really reminding, and I don't mean to sound super cheesy either, but letting those writers know how much value they're bringing to to that campus and to even a bigger conversation, but also allowing them to taste some of that conversation. Like, you know what, let's go to, I'm making this up completely, but there's a journalism, blah, 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 and we're going to take, our senior Collegian students, so you can get a sense of what's happening. Now, I don't know if you guys are doing that, but that's something that definitely would have been really powerful to have as a resource.
How do you guys create a work-life balance? Do you even have a work-life balance? Because I know a lot of people really believe in the term work-life integration. So I would love to hear.
What is that?
Yeah, I don't know. A lot of people think that their work really just becomes part of their life, and they just know how to like coexist instead of like having that balance, like that separation between work and their family and extracurricular. So I would love to hear from the rest of you guys.
Sounds like a fancy name for a pathology I suffer from. I mean, Jamie alluded to this. I'll just go first. The reality is, you want a job in journalism, get ready to work your ass off, and that's just how it goes. And some of it has to do with, like, I'm sure gender, I mean, what doesn't, like, gender somewhat play into sometimes. But a lot of it is like, you know, the field draws incredibly driven people. So you have to, you know, be competitive to a certain extent. And also, I don't know if you guys have this magic ability to control the way that news works, but we don't have the people anymore. Like, we don't have the staffing to adequately address all of the sheer volume of crises that are co-occurring at all times. So I want to answer this question properly, though, right? Which is like, there are ways, while you accept that you're going to work really freaking hard for, you know, however long, you know, you feel like the passion should still be there. Like, I would say that let that be the guiding light. Is like, there comes a point where you get a feeling a lot of the time that burnout is near. And you've got to pay attention to that feeling. And you set yourself up for success, because it is a field where that's going to happen, and that's okay. And fortunately, there's been like enough of a campaign. I strongly encourage people to look at resources at the Dart Center, that, you know, you're getting secondhand exposure to what is essentially traumatic stories often, or, you know, just like, in the most benign sense, it's like journalism is an exercise in frustration often. People don't want you to uncover the things that are worth your time uncovering. You need to be able to, like, prepare yourself for that by having enough family support, by, like, being open about, you know, different resources like therapy. So, like, you know, I've been in therapy for literally years, and it really can help a lot, because you're going to face real challenges trying to get your work done while also trying to have a life. I don't set good examples by, like, having like a robust set of hobbies. I would say that I am more satisfied by just having a robust social network. And like, if I had a hobby, it's like complaining on the phone with friends. I was very well prepared for COVID because I am a phone person. But you need to find your thing. You need to find the thing that, like, lets you, you know, lets that release valve go. And you need to be bold enough to, like, tell yourself when you can feel that erosion that you need to take a break, like a meaningful break, and, like, you know, not let it get to the point where you no longer care about the thing that you do. Because again, it's a responsibility thing. You can't get to a point where you don't care anymore. You have to continue to care. And if you don't, then you can't be in the field anymore.
I think for me, you know, even in my company, right, I'm helping women they've worked in their industries for years, and they're trying to do what they're trying to do. And even with what I'm doing as a business owner, I have to value my time. And so the question now for me isn't so much, you know, where is my life balance? The question is, where do I value my time, and how do I want to spend it? So time, to me, is just as valuable as how we spend currency. And when I think about that, it boils down to a question of, because again, I transitioned my journalism skill sets as a business owner. And so with that said, one of the things I have to still think about is, okay, well, what are the priorities? What are the core values of things I need to cover? And how do I really fit that into a crazy schedule? Because if you're someone who's, you know, you've got a relationship, or you have children, or you're balancing a full career, it's a great question you're asking. And I want to just share this thing. So I remember I had a mentor in the journalism department, Mr. McBride, and I talk to him all the time, because I say to him, am I still a journalist? Because I'm no longer like directly writing stories. Now I'm doing this, or I've pivoted into this industry. And he would laugh, and he'd be like, Alana, yes, you're still able to use these skill sets. It's not that you're no longer a quote unquote journalist. Now you're just transitioning how you're using it. And I had to really let that go, because I kind of put in a box what does it mean to really be a truth teller, and whatever a truth teller is for me. And I thought, okay, that means I'm covering stories. That's what it is. But I learned, and have learned, being a mature individual, that it's really you owning your time and putting a value to the things you want to focus on, and freeing yourself when you realize, oh my gosh, I'm about to burn out and fall to the floor. Maybe it's time for me to pivot how I'm doing this, so that you can show up and still do it, but you're not rolling down a hill. That's my biggest thought about it.
I think work-life balance is one of those things that it's sort of a constant process to figure out, and it's different. It looks different for everybody at different points in their life. And I think the most important thing is figuring out what works for you and kind of how to create boundaries too. I think the big thing is creating boundaries. So I think a little bit of what Lisa was talking about, like recognizing when you were starting to burn out, when things are just not working, because that doesn't serve you well, personally, and doesn't serve your readers well. My first job out of school was at a startup newspaper in a small city in Indiana. And we were a staff of maybe, 4 or 5 people. I think there were only 3 reporters at the time. And because we were a startup newspaper, there wasn't much money. We did not have a wire service. So that meant the reporters constantly churning copy. And after being there for 6 months, I was exhausted, and I wasn't sure that I could stick with it. And I tried. And what stinks about that is, I think at the time, because I was still young in my career, like I think I put a lot of the pressure on myself. I kind of blamed myself for burning out, but really it was the environment. It was the paper I was at. And I ended up only staying a couple more months before, luckily I was able to move to a different newspaper and be in a larger newsroom, and there was less that pressure. But I never really figured out how to find good space for myself in that. I think I'll talk about this a little bit later, but journalism very quickly becomes very consuming. Like it becomes all consuming of your time. And I think the thing that I've learned over the years is to figure out sort of the boundaries and rules for myself. So for example, social media, I won't touch social media at all on the weekend if possible. I will just turn off Twitter, turn off Facebook, everything, and just kind of walk away. And I know that's not something that everybody has the luxury of doing. I think when you're in journalism, you probably kind of have to constantly, keep a little bit of an eye out on that. But if you can even just unplug for 2 or 3 hours, if you make a rule for yourself, okay, I'm going to unplug completely for 2 or 3 hours, or I'm going to take a day off from work and just go hiking and go do something for myself. That's kind of how you create that space for yourself. And for me, I've got a 3-year-old, and so creating space and time for what's family time, versus me working, those are important things. And and just setting expectations too with the people that you work with. And I'm hopeful that workplaces are starting to change, and workplaces are starting to recognize more of the need for embracing the need for work-life balance, just being flexible with employees about work-life balance too. That these things will just kind of be institutionalized and be okay. Working in PR, like I said, there wasn't quite the work-life balance that I expected, but I definitely set the expectation of the people that I work with, that if you have some kind of emergency and it's after 5 o'clock, pick up the phone and call me, because I will pick up my cell phone. I will I'll check for text messages after 5 o'clock, but don't expect me to respond to your email at 11 o'clock at night, with a request. If it's an emergency, you will call me, and I think just setting those boundaries and expectations is, just one way to kind of carve out some space for yourself and carve out some room in your life, to create that balance.
To be honest, I myself am still working on figuring that out. So I actually just appreciated listening to everyone's advice right now, because that's been such a thing for me, where it's it really is, it's such a consuming thing, like you're saying, and work so easily can be really consuming. And I think that kind of goes back to what I was saying about things I wish I knew, is that it's okay not to know everything, because I think I was so wrapped up in trying to learn everything super quickly and just being ahead all the time that I didn't really take the time to slow down. But I found that there's 2 things that I've kind of started integrating into my lifestyle to kind of be able to have this stern work-life balance. And like I was also saying before, it has a lot to do with communication. So really being able to speak up and being I can't do this right now, or after 5, I'm not going to be available, or I know this is a really important event, but it's at 7 p.m. so I can't do it. So vocalizing that has been a learning curve for me, but it has been something that's been super helpful in creating boundaries. And another thing that I found that has been also very, very helpful and useful to me is having a colleague hold me accountable. So really communicating also with your internal network and being like, hey, don't let me do this if it's at night. And sometimes I'll lose track of it and I'll send an email at 9 p.m., but I'll have my colleague be like, I'm not even going to look at this email, get off your computer. So like being able to have those interactions is really, really, really useful, but it only comes because I was able to communicate and vocalize that this is something that I'm trying to work with. So it's like, help me work on this, because it really will take a support system. And that can be your family, that can be internally in the office, depending on the work environment that you're in. That can be, a friend group, a social network, whatever it is, but really like being able to lean on someone to hold you accountable can really be make it or break it, because you will lose yourself and you will get consumed. It's just part of the process. And I think it's like really hard to be able to manage that on your own sometimes.
Does one get better at active listening?
I use a pretty good sense of what I call pause and rate, and when I'm communicating with people in general. And that means like really taking time to clearly listen. There's two types of listening. There's passive listening and active listening. And there's that listening where you're just listening till they're done so you can respond. Well, I typically will really try to pause while they are speaking. And really, even after they're done, just kind of pause after they have said whatever they're saying, and then take a moment to reiterate back to them what I believe I'm hearing, and give them an opportunity to kind of clarify if I've heard them correctly, or to expand if I didn't hear them correctly. And I think that that's really important, especially now, because sometimes people don't even know yet what they're fully trying to say, and they really do need you to kind of be that go-to person to kind of bounce that idea off of, and then you are able to then kind of reflect it back to them. So I think that's one of the strategies that I use when I'm listening to people.
Sometimes I get anxious when I'm going to interview somebody, and it helps me to write out some of the questions that I cannot leave this interview without. I like to have the actual conversation be a conversation with a person, though. So I don't want like my interview to be scripted, because then I'll just be thinking about that. But I will write like, these are the 6 questions that if I leave this interview, I have done myself a real disservice and I'm gonna have to call this person back. So, and then like at the end of the interview, I look at that and then I say like, oh, before I do like the must do, like, is there anything I missed question or anything else you want to tell me? I will be like, is there anything that I missed for me? And then ask that. But otherwise, like having that fail safe lets me get out of my head in an interview so that I can like just be like talking to you, And I assume automatically that if I have to interview somebody, that means that I care about what they're going to say and I should act accordingly. And sometimes it's like, you should just maybe take a few minutes before your interview to be like, why do I care about what this person says? Like, what is the goal here of what I'm trying to actually learn? And let yourself be open to the possibility that they might take you in a couple different directions. But just come back to like that core goal, the questions you cannot miss, but then be like literally like zoning in, like this is the most important thing I could be doing in this moment.
How do you go about preparing your questions and picking the questions for the person you were interviewing?
So I'm an editor primarily, right? So like this is like kind of done in reverse a lot of the time. When I'm interviewing somebody, like I have like a very specific purpose for why I'm calling them. But in general, I think most reporters do, right? So, sorry, this is getting like really nitty gritty because there's a wide range of types of interviews, right? There's like your antagonistic sort of interview, in which it really behooves you in those situations to have a fundamental understanding if you think that the person's maybe not going to like what you're asking them, of what you're trying to get out of them. Like that kind of setting, like you really want to be thinking like, how are the like 3 different ways that I can ask this question that this person can now weasel out of it, So that's how you're preparing. You're preparing it by like thinking of like, I need this information. This person might not want to give me that information. Here, how can I keep coming back to the core of it? And what can I say if they don't answer the question? Like, what can I already have in my mind of like, how I can be like, no, like you didn't answer me, like, without having like so much attitude that you erode the, whatever relationship you need to be preserving at that moment. A sort of friendlier interview, like you want to be able to be making decisions about how much you actually need to like write out your questions in general. Just like have like a moment of thoughtfulness, maybe call a friend and be like, I'm trying to figure out this from this person. I think I'm going to ask them about blah, blah. And like your trusted friend might be like, oh, what about this thing? Or just get you thinking. That's like another good way to prepare. But yeah, like different types of interviews, depending on like how friendly or not friendly, will require like different levels of prep work. And I'm happy to like, I don't want to bore everybody to death with this now, but like I'm happy to elaborate on that like in excruciating detail at some other time.
I found that when I was interviewing people, a lot of times, if I just like sat long enough, like when they got to the end of a response and just sort of paused, they would, you know, reveal something that maybe they hadn't been planning on saying or thinking of. But just, you know, having, you know, those other questions, you know, for those other avenues like you can go down in sort of in your back pocket are good to have. You know, something else and this seems really strange to say because like I really believe in like really good note taking, like taking like immaculate notes. But at the same time, you know, I found a lot of value too in like recording as many interviews as possible. And you know, I would never say like go into an interview and only like only record. Like if you're a newspaper reporter, like don't go and just only record because technology can always fail. And so if something happens with your recording and it's gone, your entire story is gone. But some of it too there is that helps with active listening when you're interviewing somebody in person is if you're not always like looking down and scribbling, you're making that eye contact. You're sitting there, your body language, like, you know, nodding along with people, talking to them and everything. Like that's really powerful. And, you know, I guess back when, you know, someday when we're in a post-COVID world, location and setting sometimes matters too for your interviews, right? So I did a lot of feature writing actually at the Chicago Daily Law Bulletin. Which surprised me because I'd never really been much of a feature writer like earlier in my career. I was always doing the kind of hard news, like policy kind of writing. But I was a features writer like later on too. And one of my professors when I was at University of Illinois for my grad degree said, the place that people are most comfortable giving interviews, like, you know, people will be the most real with you at their kitchen table. So if you can interview a source at their kitchen table in their house, that's when the real conversations come out. Because that's where, you know, you sit with your family and your friends and you have like real honest conversation. So if you can be in an environment where like your source is super comfortable, like especially if you're doing something like features, the kitchen table is like one of the best places. And to also like always kind of like keep your eyes out and look around too. Like, so I mean, again, this is sort of like a feature writing tip. If you're interviewing somebody in their office, look around at, you know, what do they have on their bookshelf? What do they have on their desk? A question I used to like to ask people is, what's your favorite thing in this office? Like, what's your favorite thing on this desk? Because whatever it is that's on their desk or in their office, a lot of time it's something that's really meaningful to them. Like it's something that has like a lot of value. And that can give you another avenue to get into different conversations and different things that you never thought your source would tell you about, or that you wouldn't have figured out, you know, at all by like looking at their resume or their profile. So those are just a couple of, I guess, quick things. But yeah, this is something that we could talk about exhaustively.
I think for me, when I listen to someone speak, I'm such a visual, like I have to visualize like kind of the story or like where they're taking me with what they're telling me. And so for me, some of the best questions I've ever come up with when I'm listening are the ones that I don't have prepped, or the ones that kind of come up on the spot when I'm talking to them and I meet them and I see who they are as a person, more about their background, their environment, all that stuff. So for me, that's always been super helpful in just, you know, getting there, having kind of like a foundational list of questions, but also understanding that I'm going to have other new questions that I never even thought of the second I get there and like really go through that story with them visually. That's one thing. Another thing for me is also I always tend to pinpoint where a person shows even an ounce of emotion on something that they talk about, and kind of like just take that point and really try to savor it as much as possible, asking every every follow-up question that can possibly ask to get them to speak about it more and show more emotion about it. And that's usually worked a lot of times, where I'll see someone kind of like not smile throughout the entire interview, but then they'll say one thing that will make them smirk or smile, and I'll be like, oh, okay, let me take that kind of as a point to run with and get more information out of this person. Or I'll see something that will show some sort of body language that indicates that there's more to the story than this person's saying, and they just need some sort of a nudge, some sort of like a follow-up question that comes out of a place of concern, and a place of really trying to understand and thoroughly listen and really try to get the entire story. So that's kind of been my tactic when it comes to trying to listen and learning as I go as well. It's definitely I think a lifelong thing to learn, but
observing the things that are not said, because that's actually also very important to consider too. What is not being said, or what is being expressed, and whether that's in the environment or in the conversation, it's important for us to observe. So yeah, great.
Very awesome. We have another question from our audience, and this is a really great one. How do you put integrity and honesty at the forefront within your career when making a decision in general?
I'll just answer that. I think that in anything, well, especially because I spend a lot of my time helping people think about their digital story, right? And the challenge today is that, people sometimes, when you look at what's happening, right, people will say, well, I need to buy followers, or I need to do X, Y, and Z. And sometimes people forget their core values, because they want to be seen and heard. But it's like, I'm willing to do X, Y, and Z to be seen and heard. And one of the number one things that I spend time doing is reminding people about their core value. What are your core values, and how can I help you to maintain that? And so for me, some of the operating principles I keep to myself are, what I call my big why, which is like, what is the why behind what I'm doing? And I don't accept every opportunity, especially if it doesn't necessarily align with where I'm at, and then there are other times where I'll just look at a situation and say, this one is really not for me. And I kind of make my decisions that way. So I always keep the big why at the forefront. And then that kind of guides how I prioritize everything else.
For me, coming from a communications perspective, and I guess being the one who's trying to sell a story to a journalist and get the media interested and excited about writing about, the things that the professors I work with are doing, things that the students on campus are doing, it's really just being honest about the stories, just being upfront about the stories at all times. And some of it too is, I guess for me as a PR person, like my reputation as a former journalist, I think the producers and reporters that I talk to on a regular basis know that I'm an ex-journalist. And so, I mean, that gives me like a certain sense of credibility in terms of like knowing what they're looking for and knowing what they need from me as a PR person. And, they know like a value for me is like, I'm not going to oversell a story, and I'm not going to, like sell you something that doesn't have value to your readers, right? And I think in some cases, I'll be frank, in communications, sometimes you have to do it. Like you have to go out and sell something that you may think like is just not going to work, because that's what your job entails. You have to go and do this for your client. But in cases where it's like, you are a trusted kind of source, and you are able to kind of push back a little bit and say, hey, I can put this out there for you, but I'll be honest with you, I don't think a reporter is going to be interested in it. So having that transparency and building relationship too with, the clients that you work with, where they can trust you in kind of pushing that out there. Like that's very important, like to me, is just being really open and honest with my clients about, what stories are going to resonate. And, being open and honest with, reporters too. I mean, there's some cases where it's, I've developed enough of a good relationship with somebody where I'll be like, hey, here's this press release. Like, I understand it's not the most glamorous thing, but if you're interested, please give me a call, and reporters are, grateful that I'm upfront with them about it. And, grateful that I understand that expectation too, that there's some things that just aren't going to be there sometimes for stories.
For me, this is such a great question, especially coming from like the political sector, where this is quite literally an everyday ordeal for me, where it's like I have to constantly remind myself what my non-negotiables are when it comes to morals and ethics. And it kind of goes back to kind of what I said previously as well about communication, how genuinely critical that element is, because if you don't communicate your morals and values, people don't know where your boundaries are. People don't know where your lines are. So for me, that has been super important, especially because as a communications director, everything's about the optics. Everything's about how things look. Everything's about how things appear. And I'm sure, Jamie, you also understand that, you know, as a PR professional. So for me, it was sort of also, like everything else, truly genuinely a learning curve. But what I've been doing is not only communicating it, but also having my colleagues understand and also remind me that there are certain things that I also cannot cross the boundary with. So really, again, going back to that accountability aspect that I was mentioning, really comes in super handy. And when there is something that I am super iffy about, I feel confident enough at this point to be like, I don't feel morally okay with taking this on. Can someone else take this task if they feel comfortable doing so? So vocalizing that is super, super important, but it's something that I have to do, especially when I am reminding myself every single day about my non-negotiables. Like, what are they and how am I going to adhere to them and how am I going to stick to them no matter what the case is? And it takes a lot of, you know, really being super frank and super candid, which is not a piece of cake, but it's super, super important, especially in the realm that I've been immersed in.